All right, our HTML page is continuing to grow, and now we're going to add a form. So let's look at what form elements are available for designing a form on our HTML page. So a form, as you may imagine, has the tag form. So we're going to have an opening tag for a form and a closing tag for a form being form. And then within the form, we want to add controls. They're often called form controls. So the one form control example is a text box input. This is like, you ask for someone to type in an answer to a question, right? So this is going to be an input, and then we can set the type of the input. Generally, the type of the input controls what we want the input to collect. So we have a bunch of different IntelliSense things that are popping up here. We can make it a button, a checkbox, colors, dates, date times. The most common, I would say, is text. So we're going to start with text and work from there. An input is one of the types of HTML elements that is self-containing, so it does not need to have an opening and closing tag. It's itself just a single tag. So let's save the page and look at what that looks like. So we have just now a single form input element. Now, let's talk about this element. So by default, right, right now we don't see any other information about this element telling us what we should be typing into this field. So there's another element type called a label. So we can add a label to this text element or near the text element, and we might say like, what is your favorite Disney Disney character? Okay, we'll save. And then when we refresh the page, we see what is your, oh, I spelled it wrong. What is your favorite Disney character? And when we refresh, we can see that label next to the text input. But right now, one of the affordances that we're missing is that if our pointer doesn't land exactly in the text input, it's hard to grab focus on the input. So when you're clicking around the browser and you're not clicked within the text input, you can't really type into the text input unless you know how to set the focus. So setting the focus means that the cursor is inside of the text input. And when we focus on it right now, you'll notice that the color around it turns blue. So that's one of the affordances telling us that the text input is focused. And we were only able to focus that by clicking directly on the actual text input. So one thing we can do, if we want to make to improve the experience here, we can set an attribute on the label that says this label is for this specific input. So we can say for, and then the ID of the input. So we might set an ID on the input, char answer, and then for is going to be the same ID, char answer. So all HTML elements can have an ID attribute. The ID attributes of all HTML elements on the page should be unique. So we should never have another element on the page that has this exact same ID attribute. That's really important. And especially when targeting with CSS, we want to make sure that every single element on the page has a unique ID. None of them should be the same across multiple elements. There's another attribute called class, and that is a way that you can set a class value on an element. You can apply that to any HTML element, and a class can be shared between multiple elements. So multiple elements could have a class of like blue, or a class of, rounded corners or something. You could set the class to something that if you wanted to target it. But right now we're using the ID attribute and the for attribute on label to target this input element. What this does is this allows us to click on the label to gain focus on the input. Notice that if I click on the label now, it is setting the focus on the input so that I can type in an answer. And it's obviously Mickey. Yeah. Okay, so that is one example of a form control is a text input. Now there's a ton of different attributes that you can use with inputs. And I want to show an alternative to having your label target this field. So one alternative to setting the for attribute on the label and the ID of the label is, rather than setting your label as a sibling to the input, you can wrap your input inside of the label. So I'm going to move the close tag after the input tag. So now we have form and its child is label, and inside of the label, its child is some text content and the input element. So if I save that and refresh the page, this is another way that you can have it so that your text, or so that your label, clicking on your label targets that input box and then allows you to focus the input when clicking on the label. So that's just another way to add focus. A couple other input controls here that I wanted to show. We might have a date. We might have, let's show like what is your birthday? What is your next, I don't know, party? This might be a date time. Okay. So if we refresh those, we'll see what these controls look like. What is your birthday? That gives you, a specific date. And you'll notice that like just because we set the input type as date, we get special controls in the browser. So now we can pick a date. So our birth date is July 6th. When is your next party? This one is not working as expected. Date. Let's see. Date time. That should be a control that gives us access to show the date time, but it's not popping up any special controls in Chrome. So let's add another that is maybe a number, and you'll notice that we have now these up and down arrows that we can use. Text number is pretty cool. You can have step. Maybe your step is 100. So that means like every time I hit the up arrow, it goes up by 100 or down by 100. You can have a min of like -500 and a max of like 1000 or something. So then if you refresh the page and you go up to 1000, you can't go above 1000, and you can go down as far as -400, and that's it. So a number input is great. It helps you control and confine to just numbers. You might also have an email input, an email type input, which will validate that the content is actually an email. All right, so we kind of got out of control here. When's your next party? Like how many dogs do you have? You can only have 100 or less than 100. Yeah, like what's your email address? Right. Okay. So we have all these form controls. They're super ugly because they're not styled at all, and there's no spaces between them. But in practice, you would style this with CSS to make it so that each of your inputs are on their own lines. And then at the end, we almost always will put a button to submit the form. So here we might want to say create a button that says submit, and then if we refresh the page, we can see this big submit button. Okay, so this is kind of the basics for laying out your form, right? So we have labels, we have inputs, a couple more here. So let's talk about how we can set a bigger text area that's not just a single text input. So there is a separate control, or a separate HTML tag called text area, which allows you to collect a full like paragraph style text. See, so this is your text area. Let's see, like tell us about this video. Okay, so we refresh the page, and that gives us some instruction to like actually populate this thing. So in here we might say something like calls equals 10, rows equals 10, 20, sure. Refresh the page, and that gives us 10 columns and 20 rows. So you might play around with this to make it look the size that you would expect someone to need to type in the content that is required for whatever the field is that you are collecting data for. So that is a text area. We also have checkbox. So we might say something like input type equals checkbox, and let's see. So like what do we want to do here? We want to say like apples. What kind of food do you like? Maybe like, do you like apples? Let's add some BR here just to like make it a little cleaner. And then we'll put a BR before our button. Okay, so do you like apples? Do you like, bananas? All right, so we refresh the page so you can like both apples and bananas at the same time. Cool. So another element that you might use is a radio button. So input type radio. And there's a hotly contested like normal mode versus dark mode. So there's you can only have one choice in that case, right? Normal mode or dark mode. And you'll notice that like if right now as I'm clicking on these, typically radio input buttons are mutually exclusive, whereas checkboxes allow you to click 0 or all, like 0 to many, 0, 1, 2, 3, whatever. Whereas a radio button is typically, mutually exclusive. So the way that we define the mutual exclusivity is by setting the same name across all of the radio buttons that we want in a group of radio buttons. So we might say the name here is going to be like mode or something. And we want the same name attribute on both radio inputs. So if we save that and refresh the page, now if we click on dark mode and normal mode, we're toggling between the two rather than having individual radio buttons, right? Now they're working together by using that name element. There are several other input types. Another example is file. So you might say like, your profile pic or something, and the type of this input is file. And then we can allow the user to sort of like upload a file. So you click the choose file and that will open your choose file dialog. So that is another common control that you might come across when building HTML forms. All right, so digging into some more of the attributes that we can use on an input element, I want to just add some line breaks here so that we can see this a little better. Let's see. Okay. All right, let's refresh. Okay, so now we've got a little bit better view. So when we're talking about what your favorite Disney character is, there's a couple things that we could do here. So one is we can set the placeholder text, and that is the content that will be filled in sort of in gray in the background there. So we could say placeholder is, like Lightning McQueen or something. And then if we refresh the page, then that shows up in the background as a placeholder. So that text isn't actually like used, and that's not the real value of the HTML, but or of the element, but it like gives you an idea of what you might type in there. So if you're asking for a name, you might put John Smith as the placeholder to say like, here's an example of what you might type in here. Another attribute that's really common is value. So we might set the value to, I don't know, let's see, what's another good Disney character? Pooh, Winnie the Pooh, right? So if we set the value, now if we refresh the page, that is actual content that is pre-populated into the field. Now this comes in handy when you are using a form to edit something. So if you have some data that's in a database and you want to make a page to edit a blog post, then you want to make sure that when you're loading the form, it comes with the values that already exist in the database, and so you want to set those as the values, the current values. Now this doesn't prevent you from changing what the value is in there, it just pre-populates the value so that when the page is first loaded, when we first reload the page, the content is populated. So that's what we can do with the value attribute on a text input. Now you might be wondering, how do we set the value for check boxes and radio buttons? So if we come back down here to radio button, there is a special kind of attribute that doesn't actually require a value, and one of those is checked. Checked. So we just say checked. We don't actually set it to a value or anything. We just say checked, and then when we refresh the page, this will be checked by default. So checked is an attribute that you can kind of just like drop in, and you don't have to set a value, and it will take some binary action typically on the control. That works the same for radio buttons. So if we want folks to be defaulted to normal mode, so this is kind of like you opt them in automatically to one of these two possible mutually exclusive options, we can say checked. And then if we refresh the page, we see that that is indeed checked. Another thing that we might want to do with a field is disable it. So, like for this, what is your favorite Disney character? If we want to hard code poo and then never let anyone ever change what that is, we might say disabled. And then we can refresh the page and you'll note that like this value is filled in. That is a value. It's not the placeholder, but we can't focus this input because it's disabled. This is common too if you wanted to like, when a form is submitted, if you're submitting it with JavaScript on the client or something and you want to make sure that no changes are being made to the form before the data is sent, you might disable certain elements. Another common use is like if you want to limit the values that people are inputting, but you still want to show them what value that is going to be used, you might set the value and mark it as disabled. Another option is like you might have data that is that you can set when you're creating an object or an instance of a post or something, but you might not be able to change that data later. And so in your edit form, if you're editing some content, you might want to show all the data about that content, but if there's certain fields that were created that can't be changed, you'll disable the field and then show that it's disabled. Another thing that you could do is mark something as required. So that's another attribute, disabled, required. If we refresh the page, that will mean that if we try to submit this form, it will say that this field is required. So the browser automatically will know that just because we marked this field as required, that when we attempt to submit the form, that it'll ask us to fill in that field. All right, so those are some of the most common attributes that we might apply to the most common controls. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that the form element itself has a couple of very important attributes that we want to talk about. So the first one is action. And typically with a form, we are sending this data somewhere. We're collecting the data from maybe a search input, and we want to make sure that that data is being sent so that we can look up some results and then present those on the page. Or we might be collecting the data to create a blog post or to edit a blog post or to update your profile or create a like or create a friendship with another person on your social network or something. So we almost always want to send this data somewhere, and that's the job of the form action attribute. So this defines where to send the data. Now by default, we're going to send the data to the same exact page. We're sending it to the same route or the same path that we're currently on. So by default, this action is going back to itself. So it's kind of like a loop back request. Typically, we're going to add something here that's like create profile.php or create profile.aspx or something. Like this is going to go to a page that is accepting requests to create some data or to do some sort of search. Maybe it's search dot whatever. So these are going to be the place where we want to send the data. Okay, so then we also have a method attribute. So this defines the type of HTTP request, the verb that we want to use for our HTTP request. So very commonly for creating instances of resources or for we're updating things, we're going to use the post method. So this is like, I want to send some data to the server. So there are two types of HTTP verbs that are supported by forms by default in the browser. And there's a whole bunch of other HTTP verbs that are available, but they're not all supported by the browser. So for instance, we can't really say patch here or put or other HTTP methods, head. Those don't make sense. So we really just have get and post, and that's it. And then a web server is going to interpret the data that was sent to tell it whether or not this should be a post or a patch or a put or whatever. But you usually will have either just get or post. So post typically means that I'm sending some data to the server. Get usually means that I want some data from the server. I'm trying to retrieve some data from the server. And in the case of a form, you might use a get for a search or for like filtering down a report or for, kind of like retrieving some information that isn't really easy to grab just by like going to some URL path. So that you might use a form with a get option for just like kind of pulling back specific information, doing a query to get information. A post is going to be used for sending data to like create a resource or create an instance or create a document, upload a file. Post is going to be used to like send data to the server. So we'll talk more about HTTP requests and response later when we talk about servers and building out your web server. But for now, that's kind of the difference, and this is how you set the HTTP method on the form. All right, in the next episode, we're going to talk about a couple of more really rich media tags that we can use for videos and audio.